Are you doing like a week?
Oh, I mean, right now, none. I mean, this is my last one until April because I'm putting everything off until then because I've got to finish up the RSP and that's kind of how I usually go, unless it's somebody I've been doing work with for a long time. And then and then at that point I'll do something that they ask and I know how it's going to roll pretty quickly. But for the most, even then, they usually like to wait till April too. So that's probably what will happen.
Yeah, we don't really have the ability to wait until then. We got to get as many people following us as possible and listen to our show as possible right now. So while everybody else is taking a break, we're just getting our company up and running. So we're trying to find those hardcore people that have been listening to you guys for years. People like me. So
hey, understandable, and that's great. And I'm glad to be on, and I hope that you guys, I'll be glad to retweet it, and I'll be glad also that when it posts to share it as well.
Well, I appreciate you, man. Let's go ahead and get this show kicked off. Here we go.
This is Fantasy Intervention. Now here to intervene with your fantasy life, Chase Vernon.
Oh, yes, and of course, I am here joined by the one, the only, Matt Waldman. What's going on, Matt? How are we doing today?
Hey, we're doing great, Chase. It's always nice to be able to get to talk ball, and we're going to get a chance to do that tonight, and thanks for having me on.
No, I'm very excited. Very, very excited to have you on. I mean, this is something where I've been listening to you for years and years, and, your podcast and everything that you're doing. So real quick, do you want to let everybody know, where to find you and what kind of content you're coming out with right now?
Sure. I write for a site that I own called the Rookie Scouting Portfolio, and I basically study quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. I've been doing it since 2006. I have a publication that's been out every April 1st. No joke about that, since 2006. And I think most people, if you go on Twitter or social media and ask about it, you'll know it's got a cult following at the very least, and it's a very dedicated one. Where I show you all my work, and my site is a lot about doing video breakdowns of these players. I have a YouTube channel with over 500 videos, with including guests ranging from Vad Lee to Jamal Williams to Ryan Riddle and some other former players. I'll be doing a show with Trey Walker, the San Jose State wide receiver, coming up tomorrow. We're laughing because you should go on Twitter on my timeline and you'll see what kind of clown I was today. I clowned myself, and I'll share that story for a little bit later. But all in all, that's what I do at the RSP. And then from a lot of it is really straight up film breakdowns that scouts look at, that people in the NFL have looked at and bought, but it's a big fantasy resource, and I do gear a lot of the things towards fantasy with that. And I also am a senior staff writer at footballguys.com, so you can find me there, especially during fantasy season from basically May through January, and I'm doing my thing there every week.
Yeah, actually, I had a meeting with Joe Bryan earlier today, so that was pretty cool. Dude's a genius. He's very brilliant. So excited to sit there and talk to one of his guys right now.
Well, Joe's a great guy.
Absolutely. I've been going through your what is it, Rookie Scouting Portfolio, and it's absolutely incredible. And you actually work with somebody that is now, I believe, a head scout of who is in Montreal. You do a normal show with him?
Yeah, Russ Landy and I do a show for the past couple of years called Scout Talk, which is part of my RSP cast that you can find on iTunes. And Russ is a former scout with the Rams and with the Oakland Raiders, who has worked with the Calgary Stampeders and with the Montreal Alouettes, and he just got the job as the head of U.S. scouting for the Montreal Alouettes, which is basically a stepping stone for a GM role in the CFL. So congrats to Russ, and it's always nice being able to talk shop. We do that every other week.
Dude, that's incredible. That's awesome. I'm stoked for him and stoked for you that, you know, you're actually affiliated and associated with that. So let's go ahead and let's dive into the show, because when I listen to your show, I need substance. Like, you know, I listen to your show because you give me the facts, you give me like the stats, you give me the stuff that I'm trying to find myself. And you're just better at doing that because, you know, you've been doing it for as long as you have the resources. So real quick, you know, one of the things you've been doing lately is what you call a mind dump. So can you explain what a mind dump is for those of you who don't know what a mind dump is?
Well, it's just essentially, I spend so much time watching film, you know, especially this time of year, probably 16 to 18 hours a day sometimes. So what happens is I'm going through my third or fourth pass at players at this point, getting ready to write the chapters for the RSP. I take that, usually at the end of the week, I'll just give, different thoughts about 15, 20, 25 players in an hour. And it's not like complete breakdowns of the players, but just things that I think are interesting, or that as I'm posting on Twitter, because a lot of my posting on Twitter, I'll kind of schedule my posts. So I'm not hanging out there all day, even though it looks like I'm posting all day. And I'll occasionally, when I do go on and look, I'll see something from colleagues talking about certain players, and I'll get a gist that, okay, they're further down on this player than I am, or this is what people's views are on a certain player. So sometimes I'll talk about that, or I'll just say, this is what I appreciate about the player. Here are things or here's something salient about the player that I think really needs to improve based on what I've seen on tape. And I'm the kind of person that I have for many, many years, I've tried to avoid the whole groupthink thing, basically by not even keeping up with the college schedule. Since I'm full-time doing this as my job, and this is what brings in most of my income, I don't have to be doing mock drafts. I don't have to do what I call soap opera rankings, which is updating rankings every month to tell you what my progress is and what news changes it. I don't need to entertain people like that. People know what I do, which is I'm going to give you a ranking in April. I'm going to give you a ranking after the draft in an update of the RSP, and then I'm going to give you some updated rankings over, before fantasy drafts during training camp. And then at the end of the year, just for like a dynasty purposes, to give you updates. And that's it. So as a result, I don't keep up with things like, for example, who won the Heisman, or, I didn't even know that Lamar Jackson won the Heisman until like the summer after he won the Heisman, after I watched 3 games of him and said, well, let me read a little bit about his bio to find out a little bit more about him.
You're too busy doing work, man. You're too busy doing work to be putting out all these fake rankings and stuff.
And it's like, I understand the purpose of it, and a lot of people find it entertaining, and it can be a lot of fun. But most of my readers understand that what I'm about is trying to bring the goods of what hardcore football evaluation geared towards what can be helpful towards fantasy, and be instructive about it in a way, though, that doesn't get people too lost in the technicalities of X and O's. You're not going to hear a lot of me talking about Mills concepts and smash concepts and cover 3 cloud or anything like that. I may share things about that, but I'll explain what that is without it getting into the weeds with it. But I'll give you the salient things that you need to know that you can watch and go, oh, I understand that. At least that's the aim.
No, I absolutely love that, like 100%. And it's something that I admire, and something that, I've learned from as well to try and do with my own scouting, which is something I do want to dive into. However, before I dive into it, I want to let everybody know that we have an excellent, crew of guests coming up here very shortly. We're live every Tuesday at 8 o'clock, every Wednesday at 8 o'clock, every Thursday at 7 o'clock for a game show, and then every Friday at 12 p.m. noon to go over how to build up your own company and how to build your own podcast, how to, get into writing. We actually have Dennis from Dynasty Nerds coming on our show with us. 12 o'clock, he's the prime editor of there, the editor-in-chief over there for Dynasty Nerds. He's going to come on and talk about what it's like for new writers and what he's looking for new writers. So if you're somebody that enjoys getting into that kind of stuff, make sure you guys go hit subscribe, youtube.com/fantasy intervention. hit subscribe so you guys don't miss out on those shows. It's something as to where we're getting on the inside of how we got into doing this and how we get people on like Matt Waldman to come join our show. So if you guys are interested in that kind of stuff, please go hit subscribe on youtube.com/fantasyintervention. Let's go ahead and dive into this because I'm sitting there every time I get onto Twitter, it's just full of endless takes, research, stats, graphs, everything that you could possibly throw, on the wall and see what sticks type situation. I mean, there are people that, come up with like the stuff that you think you would never watch in a million years, and somehow you get sucked in. Meanwhile, you have people like you who, are giving valuable information. So I actually came across something the other day, and I was trying to find the exact tweet, but I couldn't. But it was something like along the lines of, since 2015, there's only been like one receiver who was drafted in the first 3 rounds who had multiple 1,000-yard seasons, under 6 foot tall or something, along those lines. And I'm like, dude, this is such a cherry-picked, correlation. This is such a bizarre way to go about, trying to make a connection between one thing or another. And it's like, why even go about and go out of your way to do stuff like this? Because then when you looked it up and you see that, there were 6 other players or 8 other players that were 6 feet tall, 1 inch taller, that actually did fit into that. It was just bizarre. It was absolutely bizarre. So with that being said, I wanted to bring in Matt Waldman to kind of tell you guys what to pay attention to when scouting and, what to just leave at the front door. Because you don't need to take every little stat into account. You don't need to take every little cherry-picked type analysis into account. So before we dive into that as a whole with the miss, I want to ask you something about the combine, right? Because we don't have the combine this year, but we still do have pro days. And for me, players actually hurt their draft capital more than they can help. But you talked about how you only come out with rankings every so often. Like, you don't throw out rankings every week because this, and this. Is the combine something, or these pro days, something where you could change your rankings, where somebody can move up a couple spots, somebody could drop off a couple spots, or you could see even more significant, movement? How much does the combine or the pro days, I guess, for this year affect how you're going to go about scouting?
Yeah, it's a great question. And with your lead-in, I love the example you brought up about the receivers, because around the time that Odell Beckham was drafted, this was going on as well. But the actual data points were, I think, 6'2", 210 pounds at that point. And I had probably one of the best, data people who do independent work on the internet about football, Chase Stewart. See, Chase, Chase is a good name. Yeah. Chase Stewart over at Football Perspective. And he and I did a joint piece talking about that on my site several years ago, which is just, again, correlation is not causation. And that is just, it's something that, and even I've had scouts tell me, that, for instance, I was told that an NFC East team, I'll just leave it at that, used something along those lines when they hired an analytics consultant. And what they realized is that they used it in a way that it was proposed that they use it as a knockout factor. Like, any receiver under a certain height and weight, they were not even going to look at. And the cooler heads prevailed and said, listen, we can use it after we vetted all the players that we've looked at and decide at that point whether or not we see some value in height and weight from that perspective, if we're looking for a certain type of player. But we don't want to knock players out who might have compensatory factors, such as you look at Steve Smith and you see that, the size that he was, but he played like he was 6'4", 230 pounds in terms of breaking tackles, going up and winning the ball. So that, there's that. But in terms of the combine, to answer your question, absolutely, the combine does have an impact. It does impact my rankings. But the reason it does is that you want to use the data and the film together, and you want the data should reflect what you see on film. And if it doesn't match up, you want to go back and watch more film, because the film gives you all the context you need. The data doesn't give you as much context. It can give you the right context, but the film has to be the basis of that. So for me, when I'm looking at different data points, I'm trying to just make sure when I see something that stands out, say, for instance, speed and acceleration, that's hard to tell on film, because sometimes you don't realize that you may be watching film and you see this running back break into the open field and a defensive end chases him down. And you're thinking, wow, a defensive end just chased this dude down. He must not be that fast. He doesn't look that fast. And then you may see that, you may not see that another time, but you see him kind of getting chased down by outside linebackers. And so now you've seen like 3 or 4 instances where he gets chased down by box defenders. But what you don't realize is that maybe those defenders who are lesser known right now are incredible athletes, or that the angles weren't great in terms of where he started, what he had to do, and you're not really looking at all of that. So the film can give you, or at least the data points can give you a chance to see, oh, he truly does perform fast on tape or in the workouts. Let me go back and give a second look to some of these instances where I thought he was slow, to help me understand the context a little further. In the same respect, you may see a player who performs extremely well in the workouts, but then you watch them and they play slow. And the reason they play slow is that they're thinking too much. You'll have players, a great example of this, and I wish I could find a link for it again, but I put it on my site at one point, was there's a wide receiver coach talking about the value of route running, and how route running, if you do it in a precise manner and understand what you're doing, you're going to play much faster. And what he did is he used 2 examples of players on the same team, one who ran a 4.7 40 as a wide receiver, and the other who ran a 4.3 40. And the 4.7 40 guy played totally faster than the 4.3 40 guy when they were doing the same things, because the 4.3 40 guy didn't know how to run routes. Now you could say, well, he could learn how to run the routes and then he'll be even faster. But the problem is that there's a fallacy about getting coached up, like that you get coached up in the NFL. You get coached up on scheme, you get coached up on the game plan, and then you basically run the same drills you ran in college and high school to some extent, and they show you what you need to work on. It's up to you then to work on. It's like if you're a musician, you have a rehearsal or a play or a rehearsal, and it's like, okay, well, you should work on these things. And they might do 5 minutes of let's play some scales when you're in high school band or something, or, you're going to hold this note to see if you can play in tune. Well, learning to play in tune isn't just holding a note for like 2 minutes and someone telling you you're sharp or flat. You got to go home and you got to work on it for hours. And that's what these guys got to do.
I mean, that's kind of like, what happened with Josh Allen this past offseason, working with Jordan Palmer, of course, and how much he progressed because he was able to put in the time and there was somebody there to hold his hand. Meanwhile, you have wide receiver coaches and stuff like that who will try to hold your hand, but it's pretty much up to you, because as soon as you leave that building, they're not going to assist you anymore. So you have to personally develop and continue to develop. So I honestly, I love that take 100%. I feel like you looked at the show sheet because you brought up Steve Smith, who we're going to talk about here in a little bit.
Well, Steve Smith's my guy, man. So.
Is he? Okay, cool. Okay. I know you brought him up actually before, but it was kind of funny because I did a bunch of research for the show sheet and then listened to your mind dump on your wide receivers. And I'm like, oh, he just brought up Steve Smith again. This is fun. But no. So, sitting there and looking at it, we have these pro days, right, that go on. And, obviously, like you said, you have to work at certain things to try and get better at. But are there any kind of drills or anything that you look at and you're like, oh, man, this guy's, could be special at this position, whether it's, running back, wide receiver, quarterback, tight end, because he did well in a particular drill? For example, we have Adam Troutman, right, who absolutely crushed the agility drills in the combine this past year. And that's something as to where for tight ends, you typically don't look at agility drills as much, but if you can play somewhat of a slot receiver, you could see him actually guarding some targets. Is that something that you think could happen, or is there a certain drill that you look at where you're trying to figure out exactly, which route you want to go with a certain player?
Certainly. Well, let's start with, say, running backs, because and wide receivers, because really all 3 of those positions, running back, wide receiver, and tight end, to me, I look at the 20 shuttle, I look at the 3-cone drill, and I look at the 40. And I would say that I probably look at them in that order. The 40, to me, it has the least amount of weight, but here's the thing. To me, the 40 has its value in the sense of what you're looking for. Are you looking for a tight end to be a game breaker? Are you looking for a running back or wide receiver to be a deep threat, or, someone who can flip the field for you and give you those 60, 70, 80-yard gains, which happen, by the way, once or twice a year, probably even in a good season for a player with that kind of speed. So it's not a frequent thing, but it's enough of a threat to stretch the defense. If you're looking for that kind of thing, then in terms of your offensive system fit as a coach, then certainly that's going to have a little bit more value. But when you're scouting like me across the board, and I don't have one specific team I'm geared towards, I'm trying to look at who has the broadest level fit sometimes, then, to me, the 40 has less weight than, say, the short area acceleration and the short area change of direction, because those things are about making people miss, accelerating through the hole, coming off the line of scrimmage and getting early separation, which then you can dictate the route. So if you're an Adam Troutman, whether you're playing inline or playing in the slot or playing split out wide, having that ability to get to full speed immediately is far more important than whether you can run at a high speed 40 yards down the field. You want to be able to get separate. Most separation happens within the first 5 to 7 yards of the line of scrimmage. And if you're not dictating the route, or you're not beating the man playing tight press against you, which again takes technique, but if you have that suddenness to execute the variety of footwork and handwork type of movements to make a defender, threaten the defender's leverage playing press against you and force them to turn in the wrong direction, and then you can have the burst to get past them, then it doesn't matter. Cooper Kupp's a great example. He's not going to be a gold medalist in any type of long distance sprint competition, but at the same time, he had incredible short area quickness times in terms of the 20 shuttle and the 3-cone drill. And, since you started with Steve Smith, I'll laugh and tell you my favorite Steve Smith story with him as an analyst, because I've always admired him as a football player. And I remember just seeing the combine, and I don't really watch the combine most of the time. I just get the results. But I tuned into the combine a few years ago just for 5 minutes, and I saw Cooper Kupp up there, and I wanted to see what his time was. And they were talking. The analyst was talking, the anchor was talking about Cooper Kupp, and then just wanted to move on. He was going to move on and talk about something else. And Steve Smith basically cut him off and said, "No, that's my guy right there. He's the best receiver in this class, if you ask me." Well, and the guy's kind of surprised. Well, why? Because he can run the routes. He understands how to run a route. He understands what to do, and he's a good athlete. He's a better athlete than what you think. And I just laugh because I've been watching him for months, and that's exactly how I felt about it. And he gets it. And as a future Hall of Fame wide receiver, he understands what we talked about, which is, that early acceleration. So, and it's the same thing for backs. To me, Peyton Barber may not excite anybody in fantasy, but Peyton Barber started as an undrafted free agent and basically outplayed some well-known high-end draft picks to be a starter on a bad team at that time. And he will have a place in the league for the next 3 to 5 years if he stays healthy, because they know what they can get from him. He's a smart runner, but on top of that, he has short area quickness and he has enough burst. He's never going to be the guy people want to be as the starter, and they're not going to want to sign him to to a 3-year contract, or they'll get a rookie in there who offers more juice in that regard. But they know if they're it's 3rd and 3 and they're going to stack the box, who's going to get them 3 to 4 yards and be technically sound and conceptually sound enough and skilled to do it? Peyton Barber can.
And Peyton Barber, a big thing with him is the fact that he's willing to be physical, but that burst allows him not only to be physical, but also fall forward constantly, which in those short yardage situations are very beneficial, to that. So it makes perfect sense where you're going with that. So let's go ahead and let's bounce over to what we talked about earlier. Do you have a favorite myth or a fake stat that people create about these rookies that, shouldn't exist necessarily? Something that's created time and time again. You just shake your head. Why is this a thing?
Yes. And I understand why it's a thing. And I'll actually kind of be diplomatic about it to say this. If you're a fantasy player, this stat makes sense for you to consider, but you're making a false equivalency about it. And that's what I can't stand about it, which is that draft capital correlates to talent. Okay. It's one that people will say, well, if you do studies and you look at the NFL draft, and who's drafted in those in the early rounds, they're the ones who are starting and producing. They're more productive than the later round guys. Okay, now that makes sense. I'm not trying to tell you that 5th round guys are more talented than 1st round guys on the whole, but there are enough. We need to understand that what makes draft capital, because draft capital isn't necessarily talent. And so I see a lot of people who are in the fantasy industry, they will say, I understand talent and talent evaluation because I'm predicting draft capital. And the reason I want to share that is that draft capital is essentially dictated by a number of factors in addition to talent. Character, whether or not you behave on or off the field and you've shown work like that, whether or not you fit the physical prototypes for the position in terms of height and weight or arm length, whether or not you had a good combine, and the combine is only approximating the physical skills to complete certain tasks. They are not even a great approximation for most of the technical skills that are used to complete tasks.
Stuff like the Deuce Staley drill, helps out with running backs and whatnot, but still it's something that might not be measured as much.
Exactly. And it's the same thing. It's like a 40 time or a 3-cone drill. The 3-cone drill is a pattern, that pattern doesn't predict whether or not the backside defensive end who's coming down the line, who got early penetration, and you're running duo, and how you need to bounce in and back, back out and then back in to avoid that, or a safety, basically how do you work through a safety run blitz that gets into the backfield as you're taking the exchange. I mean, they're not doing that kind of stuff.
That Antonio Gibson, big reason why he was out on 3rd downs this year for Washington, because he's a rookie, because he didn't get to develop those concepts. So he could have even a better year than what he had, if he had done that. However, they pulled him out on 3rd downs. So.
Sure, absolutely. And also you watch him, and there were things that he did. This is a guy he's one of the exceptional cases of someone who actually got by more on his talent, like his physical talent, than refined skills. And you don't normally see that happen in the NFL. And that tells you also how good he can be. But that's the point, is that draft capital, what school they went to, how much production they had, all those things are meant so that the owner of the team, that the GM of the team, that the executive group says, we feel good about signing him to a high-end contract because there are enough factors from a PR perspective that say to us, this guy's not going to fail. He's got the work ethic. He has the production. We can lean on him to invest on him. And it's not necessarily talent. It's more cover your ass kind of like, for instance, I got into this in the fantasy football and to studying players because I remember there was a player that Gil Brandt, the former president of the Dallas Cowboys, who was known as one of the grandfathers of modern scouting, who was on NFL.com doing a mock draft, and he talked and ranking players, and he ranked a player who was 5'9", 205 pounds, running back, and said if he were 2 inches taller and 10 pounds heavier, he would be a top 5 overall pick in the draft. And I thought to myself, what is it about that player? I think your mic was kind of got some. Oh, okay, that's good now. It's good. But he was a top 5 player. He'd be a top 5 player in the draft. This player came from Villanova, which was a smaller school. He was going to go to Florida State, but just after he accepted the scholarship, he tore his ACL. So they rescinded their offer. He went to Villanova. Then he tore his other ACL, basically playing basketball and slipping during the offseason. But he proceeded to have a huge career as a running and receiving back who had a fantastic Senior Bowl playing against top competition. He went on to play with the Philadelphia Eagles, and we know him as Brian Westbrook. who was one of the top 5 running backs in the class over a period of time. But that was instructive to me before I ever wrote my first RSP, because it got me thinking, if you know his talent and skills make him a top 5 player, but height and weight is an issue for you, it wasn't because he didn't think he'd held up. It was because he understood the perception that that executives and fans have, and what NFL teams are worried about. An NFL team that people who manage an NFL team, the blowback they would get for drafting a 5'9", 205-pound running back out of Villanova with 2 ACL tears, and he not making it, they would look stupid. And like the public perception would be, you're idiots. Why would you draft damaged goods from a small school who's not even big enough, and all of this, even though none of that matters as much as you think. But if you drafted the 6 foot, 225-pound, 4'4", 40 running back from FSU who basically has, 3,000 career yards or, 4,000 career yards on his resume, if you fail on that, it was like, well, he looked good on paper. It made sense that you'd want him, even if he couldn't see his way out of an open field. He could be dropped in the middle of a farm that's, the crops are mowed down and still can't find his way to a barn. That's what happens. So when I hear people say draft capital is a predictor of talent, draft capital is a predictor of opportunity, because the more they invest in them, the more reps they get. And the more reps they get, the more chances they get to fail and succeed. Whereas because reps aren't shared equally unless they ask for permission, like with James Robinson, where Doug Marrone said, hey, we know we're not happy with Leonard Fournette. And talk to Tom Coughlin and Dave Caldwell and company and go, hey, I want to give this guy, this UDFA, a legit shot to compete for the job, because he looks pretty good in these handful of reps we give him every day. And they're like, okay, sure, go ahead. Otherwise, that doesn't happen. These guys get a fraction of the reps, usually not against top team guys. And when they get to 1, if they don't succeed, everybody's like, see, I told you that he's no good. Whereas if the guy who's the top end draft pick messes up like 3 times out of 6 on a drill, and percentage-wise messes up more than the UDFA, they're like, it's okay. He'll figure it out. He's just getting acclimated. It's just normal bias, and it's predicated on the investment of money they put in these guys.
Now, and that was going to be the big question, was like, hey, is it more opportunity or talent? But of course, you closed it out with a strong finish there and hit me with a knockout. So I love it, man. And it's something that I completely agree with you on. It has nothing to do with the talent level. It has to do with more than that. Player like Tyreek Hill, for example, fell late because of character concerns, etc. But he's far more talented than probably anybody else in that draft, or at least close to it. Now, real quick, we're going to hop on to this, and then I want to talk about some of these players. If there's some fake stats out there, we got a lot of Twitter controversy with a few of them. So I'm going to bring up 3 of them, and I want you to tell me which ones are false, or which ones you pay attention to, and which ones you lean more towards. BMI, breakout age, and target competition. Are one of these, more heavier weighted than another one, or completely irrelevant compared to the others?
Well, I know some people who are have worked for the NFL in the area of analytics, who also were players and scouts. So they have a well-rounded education in terms of what they've done. And they say there is something to BMI, even though how it's applied, it's often misapplied. I don't do anything with BMI. Breakout age, I don't do anything with breakout age. And production, target competition, what is that, like the percentage of target share that they get? Is that
essentially
what that is?
It's more so about the other targets on your team, and how they're drafted versus their talent levels, essentially. So for example, like Henry Ruggs last year, he had Jerry Jeudy on his team along with Waddle and all this other target competition. So if it's like, he wasn't targeted as much, obviously, and didn't put up the same amount of yards as some of these other higher end draft picks did. So,
it's the aha. So that's why we don't like him, because see, we look back on what it was, and it was that target competition that was the factor, as opposed to what he did on the field.
Like, he could have done better. He could have done better if he didn't have these people here. So, that's he's a way better player than what is relegated because of the other good players on his team. But if somebody doesn't have another wide receiver 2 that's even decent, and they're just every single target is going to them, then they pretty much hit their maximum potential almost.
I think that it's one of those things where, again, it's kind of a correlation causation argument again that I think is kind of, there's probably some things, a lot of these things you could probably say, if you're in fantasy and you just want to play the odds and you don't care about whether you understand the context of football or not, you can probably win by playing the odds that way. But can I curse on this show?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's go.
Don't fucking say that you understand football. Like, it's just like, that's the thing that bothers the fuck out of me, is like to say that, when people go around talking about how much that they're experts at football because they understand, because they basically played the odds on something, that's not really understanding the mechanics of it. You're just taking a look at the odds of it. You're great at fantasy football. That doesn't make you understand a lick about football. I've met people who have won multiple $1 million daily fantasy events who, when it comes to their understanding of what makes a player good or not, they don't understand. Now, would they kick my ass in daily fantasy? Most likely, because I don't play daily fantasy all that much, even though I think the only time I played, I put in $20 and made 700, and then I decided I was done. That was basically, I don't have, we did it as part of a football guys kind of mini tournament, and so it was like we did this thing every week. And I think I came in second to Jason Wood, who also at the time didn't play a lot of daily fantasy. But we, and we have a lot of great daily fantasy guys there, and I'm not dissing them, but I think that there's folks, there's a lot of folks out there who there are a lot of people who kick my ass in fantasy football, but it's like, then again, they also get my book, so it's fun to draft against people who already know who I like and don't. But
see, Matt, see what you're doing, man. You say fucking on, and people start coming out of the woodwork.
I'm telling you, it's funny, but it is, to me. It's just the idea that there are a lot of people who do know football, and certainly I certainly have a lot to learn. But the idea that it's like, the idea that like people walk around talking about that they know about football and start going out of their lane because they know the numbers to how to play odds, but they're now trying to like say it's about, I understand talent. Yeah, screw that, man. That's just like, that's just stupid, and it's a level of hubris for that matter. So that's why that thing kind of rubs me the wrong way.
Dude, I love it, man. And it's a whole different world, obviously, with fantasy and real football. But let's go ahead and let's dive into, some of your breakdowns, some of your players. And I don't want to spend too much time. So real quick, can you actually give a shout out to where they can find your work again? Just so that if they want to subscribe to your stuff, they can?
Sure. First of all, if you're new to my work, you can just ask on Twitter, which everybody likes to joke is like a horrible place. But let me just put it to you this way. If I'm telling you to go on Twitter and ask people what they think of the RSP, that should tell you right there that I feel pretty confident about what people are going to say. Second of all, you can find it at mountwaldmanrsp.com if you want to learn more about it and see the testimonials and see video examples, or you can just go straight to mountwaldman.com to buy the thing. And you can pre-order. It'll be available April. When you get a pre-draft, you get a post-draft, you get put on a newsletter that comes out from June through December, and you get 3 years worth of rankings. And I have a new product out that is going to be full dynasty rankings. They're not, for the players, full dynasty rankings and projections that have a 2-year window. and for every basically player that I think might have a shot of being relevant. And that's a separate product. I'm not giving away anything in the RSP from that. So if you want the how and the why, you want to get the RSP. If you want just the flat answers without understanding why I like Nick Chubb more than Saquon Barkley, or why I like Lamar Jackson, as much as I did, or Patrick Mahomes, then, if you don't care about knowing that, you can get that. But I'm giving you the answers. I'm just giving you the flat answers for that. And if you're ticked off about the explanations, then you should have bought the book. That's how I put it. But that's where you can find it.
I absolutely love it. And I put out a question earlier today, and I just wanted to see what people were wondering from you. So they were sitting there. I got a fan question from Twitter, and they wanted to hear your thoughts on how far apart Zach Moss are and Javonte Williams. He feared that Williams could have the type of floor with like a Mark Ingram, although he said it's not a great comp. But is Javonte Williams' floor, as low as Zach Moss could be?
That's a good question, actually, because I think there are a lot of people out there that when they think about Javonte Williams, there are a number of people out there who are kind of like, he might be the best running back in this class. I mean, there's a lot of people who have that kind of feel because they love the contact balance. They like the all-around game. They like the size of the player. So there's a lot out there when it comes to him. But when I look at him, I certainly think he can be a starter in the league. And I think he can be a good starter in the league, but he's not my top back. And I don't even have him as the better back of the two when it comes to Michael Carter. And you're going to love this. You're going to love this when you ask this question, because you said you didn't like the Mark Ingram comparison, the person who asked the question.
Yep.
That's exactly who I have him compared to. So I was kind of like answering it the way I was doing it because I was looking up my spreadsheet to see what my comp was for him, because I thought that's what it was. So I actually have Mark Ingram as the high-end comp for him as a player, because I think he has good burst, decent but not great speed, but he's competent in a number of areas. And I loved Mark Ingram coming out of school.
Yeah.
It's just that he's a player that, when you look at his game overall, that's right. He's a good player. He's going to be, and he can be a top 10 fantasy running back.
Yeah.
So he's a great investment. He's just not the guy that you're looking at that you're saying, is he going to be a perennial top 5 player? Well, it seems like no back is anymore, other than if you hit on an Alvin Kamara every once in a while, or a Todd Gurley for a few years.
Come on, DeAndre Swift, right?
Yeah, right. So hey, when you look at it, or Nick Chubb, who still hasn't even gotten there yet, and may not because of his circumstances, but the talent's there. So you look at Ingram, Ingram and Williams, and I think that's a fair comp. And he certainly will probably be in my top 5 to 6 backs, but he's not the guy that I'm going to look at and say, is Zach Moss that floor? That's the question. I think Moss is a little more sluggish, when it comes to, compared to a guy like Williams. I also think Williams has better decision-making skills. So I think that really Moss right now has to prove that Javonte Williams is his ceiling more than that Williams is in danger of being in Moss's floor. I think that's probably a better way of looking at that. But I can see where you're heading with it. I would just say I wouldn't worry about it too much.
I love that take. That's that's a fun take. It's fun. So real quick, we, looking at 2020, we had hope for Zach Moss, speaking of. We had hope for Anthony McFarland, Joshua Kelly, who, by the way, I had ranked probably way higher than I should have had ranked, especially after finding his landing spot.
I like him.
Yeah, and then CH, obviously he went way too high in drafts, but I don't know if you're let down by any of these guys outside of CEH necessarily because, where they were drafted, but you still had hope for them in 2020, right? You're still like, oh man, they can seize a starting role if James Conner gets hurt, or Zach Moss can do it if he can overtake Singletary. Joshua Kelly can be the first and second down back while Echo plays, third downs. And then obviously CH, you thought, was going to be the main back over there. So are there any like later type running backs, right now? Because obviously CEH was never thought to go in the first round at this point in time prior to the combine and everything, right? So yeah. Are there any later running backs who you think could become a starter in 2021? Maybe like a Jamar Jefferson or a Trey Sermon or anybody like that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And the player you just mentioned, Trey Sermon, I think he's the best back in this draft.
What?
Yeah. I think he's the best back in this draft.
I like him, but I was not that high on him.
I think most people aren't. I was on Ross Tucker with Emory Hunt the other day, and we talked about running backs, and they asked who our best backs were, and they were shocked. But Trey Sermon, listen, he's not going to be well liked because he had the injury history, because he transferred out of Oklahoma and he was splitting time with Kennedy. He was splitting time with, when it comes to Ramondre Stevenson, who was a very promising back as well. Kennedy Brooks is an excellent back. So he went to Ohio State and he played behind Master Teague for a little bit. Well, Master Teague had a little more experience in the system, but when you looked at what he did at the end of the year, you have to understand that Trey Sermon's decision-making, his ability to be efficient with his movement, it's not so much, a guy like Anthony McFarland, you brought him up. I was not an Anthony McFarland fan. And one of the things is
prior to the injury including prior to the injury or just
at all. Like basically to me, somebody needed to implant a compass in his head. Like they needed Tesla. Who's the head of Tesla? I'm trying to remember the CEO's name. I don't know.
Why am I having this? I can think of any NFL player. You can literally describe any NFL player to me, and I got
the head of Tesla who wants to put
somebody hit him in the chat.
Implants into people's brains. Someday needs to put a compass in his head to find the hole. Elon Musk. Thank you. Yeah. Basically, he was somebody that, and I've profiled him. I did some film work to show an example of Anthony McFarland where the decision making that he has, he's very dynamic as an athlete, but doesn't understand how to run the football other than straight ahead gap runs where you just follow behind one lead blocker. But when you're asked to actually manipulate creases by pressing and cutting to understand where the creases are going to develop and setting them up or avoiding penetration and getting back into your line, he doesn't know how to do that. And I took an exact play that he ran and Frank Gore last year ran. Frank Gore, who basically should be collecting his NFL pension at this point, is still playing, and Frank Gore is outgaining Anthony McFarland on this type of play with the exact same type of penetration because Anthony McFarland doesn't know where to go, doesn't know how to get back in line, doesn't know how to use his feet and agility. Frank Gore, who's not as quick, not as fast, doesn't have the spring in his legs anymore that Anthony McFarland does, and never even did on his best day after his two injuries. Before his two injuries, he was probably the best back I ever saw in terms of college and was basically, the college recruiter for Oklahoma State said, who was Larry Coker, who recruited running backs like Thurman Thomas and Barry Sanders, said the best high school back I ever recruited was Frank Gore, and I recruited Barry Sanders and Thurman Thomas. But then Frank Gore had 2 ACL injuries and came into the league kind of messed up. But the point I'm making is that when you look at these players, Trey Sermon has that efficiency of movement and understands how to make defenders miss. He has the burst to get outside. He can beat safeties and cornerbacks at the in open space with his short area quickness. He's a better receiver than his production has shown. And can McFarland become Heinz Eckler? If he works on his game, or used in a very small role, I don't know if he could become Eckler, but maybe more like Heinz to a degree. I think that's probably he'd be aspiring to Heinz, that's for sure. But Sermon, to me, there's a lot of people that I bet in the NFL are thinking we don't need to draft a first round back. We can probably get him in like the 3rd or 4th round and get the value of him that way. And I think that you're going to find out that he may not be your number 1 back to pick in fantasy, but he'll be that guy that with my pre-draft, what I love to do with the RSP is rank them how I see by talent. So he's most likely my number 1 back and by a decent margin. And then I'm going to, and then in the post-draft, what I'll do is I'll have a cheat sheet that will show by ADP where people are actually picking these players versus my rankings. And I'll re-rank the players based on fit, because fit can have if Trey Sermon goes to New Orleans, to be the Mark Ingram to, Kamara and replace Latavius Murray, that might not happen right away. And it may not even yield what you would expect if you compared to going to Pittsburgh. So he may drop. But if he goes to a decent team, like I did with Nick Chubb, when I had him rated over Saquon Barkley, everybody told me I was an idiot, or Patrick Mahomes is my top quarterback, I'll say, all right, this is where I have them. This is the sweet spot of where I'm going to tell you where to pick him. Like, I still have him ranked first because I like him that much, but you're going to want to draft, but everyone else is drafting him at the beginning of the 3rd round. So take him at the end of the 2nd or the mid-2nd so that you can get value out of it and not overpay, but you're still going to make sure that you get him. And that's what my rankings do in the post-draft. So I have a feeling Trey Sermon's probably going to be one of those guys. I can't hear you.
Sorry, my bad. I forgot to put myself on mute.
That's right, my buddy Gene does that all the time. So
normally Shane's the one that I have to tell to take off mute, but it was me this time. I just enjoy listening to you. So hopefully, or looking at it, I'm pretty much just as high on Gainwell as you are on Trey Sermon. I feel like Gainwell could potentially stand out. And obviously he opted out this past season, with COVID, because he had 4 family members pass away with COVID. So, obviously he felt like he was susceptible because his family was, but that was not a risk he wanted to take, but it gives him an opportunity to put on weight the right way, which I think is something that running backs struggle to do because they try to do it between the end of the season within a 2 to 3 month period before the combine, and they lose their speed, they lose their agility. So they either don't want to put it on at all, and then they come in weighing way less than they should, or they don't put it on the right way, which hinders their ability to develop. Christian McCaffrey is a great example of that, as to where he slowly started putting on the weight the right way. And people saw him bulk up and they're like, oh, that's going to hurt him. It's going to hurt his agility. It's going to hurt his speed. It's not going to hurt anything because he did it over time. He did it the right way. It's all about doing things the right way and developing your body and your skill set the right way. So go ahead.
I love that point because, another guy who did that was Ray Rice. Ray Rice from year 1 to year 2 was even quicker because of putting on that weight. And Kenneth Gainwell reminds me of Tiki Barber in that sense. Tiki Barber came in as kind of a 190-poundish back who was kind of a returner. And then towards the end of his career, he was an absolute balls-out monster of a running back once he cured himself of the fumbling problem. But Gainwell reminds me of a Tiki Barber type back, which maybe to some people is a modern day version would be Alvin Kamara.
Whew, that's fire, and I love it. I'm here for it. Let's go. Antonio Gainwell. All right, so let's go ahead and hop over to the wide receivers. You brought up in your mind dump, I believe it was, how this draft is filled with weapons at wide receiver. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So sitting there and looking at the difference between, last year and this year, it's obviously significant, which I'm going to bounce back to. But I wanted to bring up the point that I feel like this is almost reminiscent of the late 90s, early 2000s when we saw like receivers like Torrey Holt, Donald Driver, Lavernius Cole, Santana Moss, Steve Smith, Reggie Wayne. The last 3 were actually all drafted in 2001. So they had 10 wide receivers going the first 2 rounds. You also had like mid-level guys with Darrell Jackson, Brandon Stokely, Marty Booker, Peerless Price. They had decent careers. So first off, is this reminiscent for you of that because of the downfield threats, the smaller wide receivers, by the way? These were all wide receivers who were under 6 foot. This is speaking back to the point that we made earlier. Is this something as to where like this is almost reminiscent of these speed backs and these technicians to an extent coming back into play? Or is it something completely different because the NFL is changing so much?
Yeah.
And what's the difference between this year and 2020?
I think it's a little different based on that the offenses were different than that at that time, because some of those players you mentioned probably would have been even better in this era.
How crazy is that to imagine? Like,
yeah,
Santana Moss, Laveratus Cole, Steve Smith, Torrey Holt being better.
And that's look at Santana Moss as a perfect example. This is a guy who had like a 1,400 yard season. During an era where basically, they weren't giving away pass interference penalties to the extent that they are now. Too. Yeah, exactly. So Santana Moss to me was a great comparison for a number of these young players that have come out in the past. And so. Listen, and Steve Smith, I mean, some of the years he's had just were insane, especially with Jake Delhomme throwing him the ball,
That dude's a whole different monster, though. He's whole different animal.
Yeah, exactly. So this, I think a lot of it is that you're going to see players who may not be as complete of wide receivers who can still function well because we have more receivers on the field. You can use them in more specialized roles. As opposed to you have two receivers on the field and you're playing two tight ends or with a fullback. These players have to run more of the route tree, and do a more diverse type of work. Whereas here it's like, well, if you've got 4 receiver sets, you've got guys who can, run just a smaller portion of the route tree and have high level of success because of the matchups that you're giving them. I mean, there was at the time that Tyreek Hill was taking the league by storm in his first year, he wasn't the receiver that he is now. I mean, he was a talent for sure, and he was unstoppable in certain situations because of his athletic ability and his understanding of the game. But you're not asking him to run the complete route tree at that time. You're putting him in situations where he's matched up with linebackers and safeties, and they're not putting the shutdown corner on him yet. So it's the same thing with this particular class. There are a lot of guys like that. Kadarius Toney, I like how he tracks the ball. I like that he can run after the catch. But at the same time, he's got some work to do on his routes. I think he can get there, I
was about to say, about to badmouth Kadarius Toney because, we need to have a conversation.
No, I think he's a very good prospect. But at the same time, you're not going to sit there and go, well, we're going to line him up as the flanker right now in an I formation set and ask him to be just the main guy over and over again right now. I mean, if you put him in a Golden Tate type of role with some opportunities to do other things in the slot and move him around, sure, he can be good. So do I like this class better? How do I like this class compared to 2020? I think 2020 is a better class up at the top. And that's fine. But I think the depth of this class is pretty comparable. The depth of this class is pretty comparable. And it doesn't mean that there aren't guys here who could grow into massively good players. Like, to me, Rashad Bateman's a good example of a guy who I don't think has far to travel before he could become a really exciting player. Tony's another good example. But, how many teams are actually going to lean on their slot receiver to be the main guy? So what is that? Right. And you could say Minnesota, you could say Cleveland, and that's fine. There are some teams like that, but even those teams
they use more two tight end sets anyway. So
and when you have Stephon Diggs and the guy on my fantasy team that I kept, Adam Thielen, when you have those two guys, they're fantastic players. I like Elijah Moore a lot, but is he going to be a highly productive receiver in that 1,100-1,200 yard range? Probably not,
I love his hands. His hands. His hands are magical, right? Like they're like some of the most brilliant things I've ever seen, but he can't get off the line. If they put press coverage on him, he cannot get off the line from what I've seen. Am I incorrect by that? Or
no, I think that he has some troubles with that for sure. But his hands are, I would call him can't drop, won't drop, because that's basically.
Oh, they're so soft.
Yeah, it's fantastic. But he's great. He's great for the slot in that respect because he'll draw matchups. But again, if it's a spread out offense, that's a different thing. How do we feel about Jaylen Waddle? Can I answer that one right away?
Absolutely. So that's why I brought it up. And of course, I want the people that are listening to the podcast that aren't watching the live video to be able to listening in as well. So what do we feel about Jaylen Waddle in terms of hands, technique, route tree, and anything in that ballpark?
His hands are very good. I mean, this is a guy that goes up and wins contested balls, and he understands how to use his hands to do that. He has excellent sideline awareness, which is the ability, and not even awareness, but technique to be able to drag the feet. He's already dragging the feet. There are most wide receivers, we're just happy to see them get 2 feet down every once in a while, or to tap their toes in bounds, and that's not the way you want to do it. In the NFL, when you try and tap your feet in bounds, what often happens is that the defender pushes you in the back, and it disrupts your ability to hang on to the football or even get your feet in as you're airborne trying to come down. This is something that was actually, I've sat in there and listened to that explanation from Al Saunders, who coached the likes of Anquan Bolden and Larry Fitzgerald and a number of pros over the span of 20, 30 years in the NFL. At the Senior Bowl, talk about this to, a young Chad Williams out of Grambling a few years back, who was with the Cardinals for a cup of coffee, and just talking about, Waddle, he already understands how to drag the feet. I think that he's going to have a little bit of work to do against press just because he doesn't see it that often. But he understands how to work back to the ball and work with his quarterback. He runs enough of the route tree that he'll get better at the other things. And really, he's so exceptional in terms of his burst and speed that he's going to be one of those guys that, except against some of the top corners in the league, he's going to probably get away during his first year or two of getting away with sloppier breaks and still being wide open. So now if you ask me whether like Tylan Wallace, or Terrace Marshall will have to work on their certain aspects of their route running with their breaks to make sure that they're absolutely on point, I would say yes, because as good as they are as athletes, Jaylen Waddle is just he's basically an alien when it comes to his physical skills.
Who do you have over in, for fantasy purposes, Jaylen Waddle or Devonta Smith?
Jaylen Waddle. And it's close enough that I would say, it's going to depend on the fit, but it would take the fit would be this. Jaylen Waddle would have to go to a team that basically the team has their head up their hind parts. And Devonta Smith would have to land in a great situation for me to flip-flop them. But I would say that Devonta Smith is probably more likely to he's the safer pick. Jaylen Waddle is probably the more out of this park, high-end player. He's more likely to give you the Tyreek Hill production than Devonta Smith will. But really? Devonta Smith is more likely to give you the Stephon Diggs type of production year after year.
That's interesting. So obviously that's more hit or miss compared to more consistency. Is that what you're leaning towards?
I think so, yes. But Waddle's kind of that home run who, if he hits in the right spot, I think he's the best weapon in this draft.
Well, prior to 2020, Tyreek Hill, I believe over the course of his career, only hit wide receiver one numbers in 50% of his games. So it might have even been double-digit fantasy points. I can't remember what the study I did was, but it was 50% of his games that he played in, only hitting, I think it was double-digit points. Yeah. So that makes a lot of sense, when it comes to boom or bust potential. Meanwhile, Stephon Diggs, he could give you a good ceiling, but it's never going to be up there because he was with Kirk Cousins for so long. Now he's, it's that can of worms is open. So I can see how that could explode. Oh, I love that take.
Good points.
So sitting there and looking at the tight end position, I know you probably got to get out of here because we've been going a little bit over an hour now. So I'm going to try and fly through this.
Worries.
Well, we can spend all night. It's up to you.
Well, I do have a little bit more I got to do. I got to finish one more quarterback before I write the chapter for the RSP, but we can take another 15, 20 minutes. It's no big deal.
Cool. We got one more question or two more questions along with the question from a guest. So let's go ahead and knock these out because we have the tight ends. And obviously the only one that matters is Kyle Pitts. No, I'm just kidding. But honestly, all right. So I originally wrote this up as a joke, right? Because I was you still have Pat Freiermuth. Is that how you say his last name?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
You have, Brevin Jordan. You have Hunter Long, Trey McKitty to an extent. But I'm sitting there and I'm going through the game film, going through the stats, I'm going through the their games per and the transfers and everything else. And I'm like, dude, everybody's so high on these other tight ends. And I'm like, okay, Brevin Jordan's probably my favorite one, but he hasn't played more than 9 games in a college season, and he's constantly injured. Like, I actually love his fit with the Ravens to be a complimentary piece to Mark Andrews, as Nick Boyle just signed a new contract. And I think that tight ends, with their pricing, with how, we just saw George Kittle get, re-signed to a massive contract. We had Travis Kelce get re-signed to a massive contract. I don't think that obviously Mark Andrews is worth that kind of money, but he might outprice himself from being re-signed from the Ravens, especially with his injury history. But for this year, they could treat it like a Hayden Hurst and Mark Andrews situation, and all of a sudden get a rookie contract who, obviously he's injured a lot, but they don't have to rush him out there, and they can worry about developing his health a little bit. I like that fit for Brevin Jordan, but I mean, outside of that, like, I'm not a big fan of these other tight ends, and I don't think I'm nearly as high on them as a lot of other people are. So, I mean, have you had a chance to really dive in and mind dump on the tight ends yet?
I haven't.
Go ahead.
I haven't done that yet, but I've dived into them pretty well, and I'll probably give them one more run in a couple weeks just to look at some things but I'll say this. I mean, Brevin Jordan is a heck of a player, and he's a good blocker, and he's
so physical.
Yeah.
He's so physical.
But the downside of that is he reminds me of a player build-wise, and when you talk about the injuries, reminds me of a player build-wise of someone else I really liked.
Oh my God!
Didn't pan out, and that's a guy. I don't think it's the guy you're thinking, but his name is Orson Charles, who was a tight end at Georgia, who had bounced around from Cincinnati to Atlanta and Kansas City, and really no one's ever heard of him again. So
I had Delaney Walker.
Oh, okay, no, but I mean, I could
a guy who got more physical over time, and the more he got physical, the more.
I think that's a really good comp. I think I might steal that comp from you or give you credit for that when I do it. But I like that for him because I think he can be a heck of a player. I like Pat Freiermuth. I think Pat Freiermuth would be the fit. I wouldn't be surprised at all if the Baltimore Ravens drafted Pat Freiermuth if they could. He seems like their kind of player. He might be the best blocker in this class. I mean, he's
a very good blocker.
He's an unbelievable blocker, but he's also
great wingspan. It looks like too. I can't tell really on film, but it looks like he has a massive wingspan.
His technique's fantastic. Flat back, gets off the line well, understands the different types of blocks he needs to do, how to get into people's bodies, and really uses leverage well for his size. And he gets down the field pretty darn well and can go up and win contested balls. So that tells me that he may not be Kyle Pitts in terms of, and nobody is, but he's someone that, Mark Andrews certainly, I wouldn't even say Mark Andrews is TJ Hawkinson in terms of athletic ability. But he's certainly good enough. And I think that Pat Freiermuth could very well be that type of player. If the Ravens decide they're going to look for another tight end early, he would fit their profile incredibly well. So I like him. I think Matt Bushman out of BYU is intriguing because he's got that kind of Mark Andrews type of receiving skill. Although he's not a great blocker, but I don't think Mark Andrews was much of one either coming out. Trey
he's not a blocker at all. That's why they had to sign Nick Boyle to a long-term contract.
Right.
Nick Boyle has to be the one blocking.
Right. So those guys are, I think, probably the 3 guys that I'm really interested in. The other guy that intrigues me is an Iowa player by the name of Sean Byer, who's 6'5", 248, who was a former receiver, who has been kind of nicked up. But when he plays with the quickness and movement that you really like. Now, I'm always leery of former players who are alums of a team talking up the prospect that came after them that they might have worked with a little bit. But, George Kittle had nice things to say about Byer as an athlete, and he certainly can catch the ball. And
we know what happens with George Kittle associates.
There you go. That's right. And one of those players and I like Tunyon. He was a guy I talked about in my post draft as, watching him at Indiana State certainly was fantastic. Lions could have used him. They could have, as their second tight end for sure. Imagine if they or even their first, not with Hawkinson, but before that. So yeah, I like 3 to 4 players in this class, and I think there's maybe a couple more that are intriguing enough that in 2 to 3 years, right place, right time, right system, you might be saying, "Oh, I'll take this guy off waivers and use him for the season." It might not be a long-term thing, but worth knowing about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I just think the tight end class behind, obviously, Kyle Pitts, is similar to last year, where we saw, I believe it was the second latest tight end drafted since like 1997 or 1993 or something, with Cole Kmet at 43rd overall. So, that was something I was diving into, is just how late these players were selected.
Go
ahead.
I would just say I would take a second look at Freiermuth, and I think you appreciate Jordan for what he is and understand that, but I'm pretty high on Freiermuth. I think
I like Freiermuth. Right now he reminds me of Jimmy Graham in the second part of his career after he left New Orleans Saints.
Wow. Okay.
It just, the athleticism is there, but it's not. He has the length, but it's not, not making dynamic plays. Once again, you've watched him probably 3 or 4 times through. I've watched him through twice. So, and I have a limited, film study from probably what you have too. I have a chopped up film, but it's, 4 or 5 games compared to probably the multiple games you have. But yeah, I'll go back and revisit it, and, hopefully I can find something with him. What about Hunter Long?
I think he's a competent player. And so what that means is better reality, not as good fantasy. But he's someone that I think has enough as a blocker. He can occasionally stretch the seam on play action routes for you, or throwbacks, but he's not the guy that you're going to go, let's match him up, and
try and get him on the outside.
Yeah, we're not going to Travis Kelce him. No one's going to mistake him for Kelce. That's for sure.
That makes perfect sense. So let's go ahead and close this show out. We have 2 more questions from the crew, or from the people in the comments, and then we have a question from Jeff. So first off, let's start out with Juan's question: is Trey Lance your top quarterback?
No, not at this point, because again, I'm still solidifying my rankings, but he will be among my top 4 probably, and he will have a grade as a future starter. I think that his fundamentals for what you're looking for in the pro game are probably as good as anybody in this class, maybe better. I think that his decision-making is underrated. And a lot of people are looking at a lot of the checkdowns that he throws and don't understand that that was a function of his offense that actually wanted him to throw to the tight end and the backs as his first and second reads. And so when you see him actually throw deep, as he's actually going short to deep instead of deep to short, but the offense he plays in, that may sound backwards to a lot of people, but the offense he plays in is a pro-style offense. There's a lot of things that he does that are very, very complementary to that. And he has much better deep accuracy than Carson Wentz ever did. So if you're a logo scout and saying, oh, Carson Wentz came out of North Dakota State and I don't like Carson Wentz, well, to me, Carson Wentz is not the prospect Trey Lance is. The difference is that Trey Lance does try and make some hero throws, thinks he can burn a hole through the defensive back's jersey occasionally. Maybe not through his jersey. He's not Jameis Winston in that sense. But he thinks he can use the ball like a scalpel to throw to the narrowest margin of open space to the receiver. So at least he knows that it's not like at least he knows where the defensive back is. I have Lance and Fields very close together. I'll put it that way and leave it at that. I have them all with a grade where I think that they could either start sometime this year. Better off though if you give them an extra year. If it's a wise team drafts them, and there are not many wise ones.
How mobile is Trey Lance?
Trey Lance is very mobile. Trey Lance can either run around you or run you over. People will look at a guy like, think Matthew Stafford, and like say Matthew Stafford is on the low end of the spectrum. And you think about Stafford, he can run around everywhere behind the line of scrimmage. He can run and get you and move the chains, but more than just move the chains. Because like Matt Ryan can move the chains. He can give you 10, 15 yards when he breaks the pocket occasionally. But Matthew Stafford will take what Matt Ryan would do and add another 10 yards to it. Like he can give you that 25, 30-yard gain. Well, when he's not playing with broken bones in his back or whatever's been going on with him for recent years. That's the low spectrum. The high spectrum is Steve Mcnair. If you remember Steve McNair, Steve McNair was a guy who could run you over and also outrun you. He's not Randall Mobile, no. But he's more of think of a back who can spin. He got the spin button. He can certainly dip around you. He's not going to fake you out in the way that Justin Fields is. He's not that quick twitch, but he's the guy that can make one move, lower his pads, and the safety who tries to put the kill shot on him is going to be on his ass as often as many times as he hits and wraps up Lance. And when he does that, he's going to have to hang on for a little bit too. So Lance is more, I don't want to say Cam Newton-like because Newton was an absolute bull, but let's say that he's, there's Stafford, Cam Newton, Steve McNair, and he's just, he's between Stafford and Cam Newton.
I love that take. So does this hinder a running back if he gets drafted to a running back that's a pass catcher, essentially? Like we're seeing with Jalen Hurts. Is he going to hinder their upside, or is he going to dump off? Because we just talked about how he dumps off constantly because he's a function of his offense.
I think it just depends more on the offense than it does on what his skills are. Because Jalen Hurts could play under center, but I would say that the difference between Jalen Hurts and Trey Lance is that Trey Lance is already very advanced with his drop back footwork. With 3, 5, 7-step drops, his play action game is probably the best in this class. So he's a guy that if the San Francisco 49ers, the Minnesota Vikings decided to draft him, he would be a perfect fit. And I would even say I wouldn't be so upset if they started him earlier in those systems. As a Browns fan, I was rooting. To be honest, I was kind of rooting that Baker Mayfield would not come around, even though I'm happy for him because I don't want to root against guys. But as a Browns fan who wanted the ideal situation, if I was rooting for the ideal situation, I was hoping that the Browns would wind up with Trey Lance or a chance at Trey Lance if things weren't going to work out for them.
All right, I do have a Justin Fields question coming for you because I'm pretty sure that Jeff's going to freak out if I don't ask it. But before we do, I'm going to get to this last one. Do you worry about Zach Wilson coming into the NFL when so much of his success was, deep outside throws off the play action fake, kind of classic college offense that doesn't happen in the NFL? I know another team that uses the play action a lot, and that's the 49ers. Maybe he could succeed if they could trade up, but I doubt that would ever happen. So what do you see with Zach Wilson moving forward? Are you concerned at all?
Yeah, I'm concerned at times. He doesn't really bowl me over as a prospect. I think he has enough tools to develop into a starter, but I don't think he's going to take the league by storm. I think in the same way that Baker Mayfield didn't, looked good early on, but then didn't take the league by storm. I think that Zach Wilson is going to be that kind of player that needs more development. Because here's the thing: I love the back shoulder throws. I love the ability to go downfield. But I also think that he doesn't get tested a lot with certain types of defensive leverage to read and understand how to make those complex decisions. We haven't seen him deal with that on that level because of the spread out offense. He's someone that when you look at his, I think he has good pocket presence overall. I think it's better than Baker Mayfield's. So I think that that's a plus going for him. He's a guy that will step up in the pocket. He isn't a guy that will outrun his, his blocker's position and create more pressure for himself. I don't think he does that as often as, especially last year this past year compared to last year. I think he was much better in that regard. His arm and his mechanics. He has a front leg that gets too stiff when he throws the ball, which causes two things. When it's shallow routes, the ball sails. When it's deeper routes, the ball dives because it loses gas. loses the velocity. And
didn't Tannehill deal with the same type of issues, or am I incorrect on that?
I don't remember, to be honest with you. I wish I did.
I know. I just randomly came up with that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. It's okay. It's a good question. I just don't remember. He might have, but it's something that can be correctable with the front leg. Footwork's usually the easiest thing to fix with a quarterback, because that's something that you can drill over and over again. And your feet, for some reason, neurologically, have a better ability to gain and retain new information, because you use them in such complex ways already. Just the sheer act of walking is a complex operation. So your brain, I think, kind of gets used to adding more and more in terms of certain things. And especially with guys who are doing different footwork drills all this time. So I like Wilson, don't love him. I like him enough, but I don't. The idea that he's a first round prospect to me is more indicative of how the NFL is about. We think there's any shred of potential there, we've got to draft him in the first round. Whereas in real life, like if the NFL were like more realistic and about developing players and not trying to get them on the field right away and not that desperate in the way that they go about it, he'd be the guy that you draft in like the third round or the fourth round and say, in a couple of years, he could work out for me. And we just need to give him a year to sit, work on some things, maybe let him play some games. When we get blown out or when we're in a certain period, we can give him some packages and then sit him and then do that every so often to give him a taste of the game. But the league doesn't do that anymore.
All right, we're closing you out with an opinion, and then we'll go through the outro, make sure we get to plug your company one more time. But we have one more question from Jeff, right? Got one more question from Jeff, because he needs to make sure that Justin Fields is your 101 at quarterback this year.
He needs to make sure. Well, Jeff's going to be disappointed. Sorry, Jeff. But that doesn't mean that if you want to pick him as your 101 that I'm going to argue with you about it, because I think he can develop into a good starter. The guy I would compare him to may be a little offbeat comparison because it's not directly about physical skills.
It's Wade Haskins, isn't it? I'm just kidding.
It's Josh Allen.
Because
if you think about if you think about the fact that both players have great arms, both players have great arms. Wasn't I busting on you about Buffalo a few weeks ago over at Dynasty Vipers? I think I was, Jeff. But I'm glad I made up for it. But really, yep. See, there we go. See, I'm glad too. But the thing with Josh Allen is that incredible arm. Certainly had moments where you looked at his pocket presence and go, that's what a pro player should do in a difficult situation. The ability, the moments of accuracy were great. And then there are moments that you're like, what the hell are you doing? Like, what? This isn't even like, I have watched tape with someone who wanted to learn and we kind of bartered services. So I watched tape of Josh Allen at Wyoming with him. And I let him form his own conclusion as I was just showing him things. I didn't say what was good or bad. I just said, this is a technique he either doesn't show or what he is showing. And at the end, he goes, this guy is not even an NFL quarterback prospect. He shouldn't even be one. Like, how is this guy the number one NFL prospect? And that's what can happen when you look at moments of Josh Allen's game. But in the right circumstances, he was able to develop, and they fit the right system around him, and he got the hero ball out of his game and some of the short circuiting that happens to him when things go bad. And he matured and he worked at it, and to all his credit, he's become the player that his ceiling portended. When you look at Justin Fields, there was a lot made about a week or two ago about how he makes a lot of first reads and that's it, doesn't read the field, and that he's got a slow processor. And some people were ready to say, oh, it's the NFL doing basically a hit job on him, and it's about race, in the same way that it was like Teddy Bridgewater with skinny knees, or Lamar Jackson and the things that they said about him, or or the leadership with Teddy Bridgewater, which was an absolute joke because he was
I
a great
love
leader.
Teddy Bridgewater. He was a great leader. Great leader.
Yeah. I mean, there were NFL, as I've written, there were a scout basically shared with me the league testing before the draft that showed what a lot of teams hired a military-based outfit that does these like military-style testings, and they graded all the players doing it, and he came out tops in like several categories, but there were GMs saying that he didn't have leadership skills. So that was kind of more blatant. When you look at Fields, to me, it's not that. It's like when you look at Fields, there were a lot of plays where he would look to his first option and they weren't open. And he did have a lot of plays that did come open because of the way they spread the field. But there were plays that you look at and go, they weren't open, and he was still staring down the player, and the safety's playing over the top, and he's like, the safety's just reading him, and he's not doing much with that. Or he would be late to recognize certain leverages while he was also not staring down the safety long enough to hold him. So he's either needing to throw the ball quicker or stare down the safety longer and come back to it later to make that throw. Some of these things are a little bit more advanced concepts that he can learn to do in the NFL.
It takes time to learn how to develop those concepts, and it takes reps, and it takes practice, and it takes the best safeties in the game to make you develop those too.
It does, and while I fear that he may never have the elite processing speed, it doesn't mean that he doesn't have potential to be a starter with the processing that he has, and that because of the fact that he has the huge arm and the accuracy with that arm, which are both very strong, and the element of his legs to create, he may not need as much of that because they're compensatory factors. He may not need to have the fantastic processor that a Tom Brady has, on that level, because Tom's playing in the tight confines of a pocket. He's got to play in a box, whereas Justin Fields can play all over the field. So so I'm totally sold on the idea that Justin Fields can develop into a good quarterback, but there is a potential that a team could fuck it up.
Oh, easily. I mean, the Jets, maybe the Jets
there's potentially could go to the wrong team and be in a system that slows things down, and then he gets pounded and his confidence gets lost, and then there's pressure that shouldn't have to be there that can make things more difficult for him to dig out of. But I think that if you're going to make an investment in him, it's a wise one.
What if he falls to the Carolina Panthers at 8?
I think that if he does that, you're going to see the Carolina Panthers revamp their offense.
It's going to be insane, right?
And it'd be fantastic with the current weapons that they have, and what they could do with him and McCaffrey. I mean, McCaffrey will be that guy that we're talking about. As long as he stays healthy, we'll be talking about him for the next 3 to 5 years. Which we don't do that very often with running backs anymore. He could, with Justin Fields, Christian McCaffrey could wind up threatening. He could be one of threatening the all-time rushing list. Maybe not the top 3 to 5 guys, but he could probably crack the top 10 and probably threaten the all-time all-purpose yardage list. If he plays at least another 5 years in Carolina, why not? At the rate that he's going.
Dude, it's an insane rate, and it's a rate that is obviously not sustainable, because of his injuries, but it'd still be very interesting if he's not, if he doesn't keep, getting these injuries at his size. Now, let's go ahead and let's plug one more time, what you're doing, where we can find you, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure. MountWaldmanRSP.com. You can take a tour of the rookie scouting portfolio. I've been doing this since 2006. As told to me by, recruiting coordinators at major division schools. Mine and Dane Brugler's draft guide, I'll plug Dane's as well, are the 2 most read independent draft guides by scouts. And I certainly have been in touch with folks who have bought my book. It's very cool. It's an honor to have that, to have been told that and find that out. And of course, you get the pre-draft, you get the post-draft, which comes out no later than a week after the NFL draft, which is a cheat sheet and rankings and depth chart reviews. And then you get you also get the newsletter that comes out monthly from June through December with updates about what I'm doing for 2022, as well as what I see in 2021 with players, early in their development from rookies to second, third year players, and talk about them. And you get it for $21.95. It's a great deal.
Are you kidding me? That's it.
That's it. And
I thought it'd be like $100 or something. Like
I didn't even look
at the price.
There are people who literally tell me that they would pay that much for it, but I undercharge. I know that, and I also give a percentage away. I give a percentage away to an organization called Darkness to Light, which is an organization designed to educate people so that they can prevent sexual abuse of children, as well as to address it in the proper way so that kids don't have the trauma compounded when adults don't believe them about what happened, and how to be able to handle it and address it. It's a great organization, and I would highly recommend taking a look at it. But I've been giving to them since 2011. And I used to do 10% of every sale. Now I've capped it at about $5,000 a year. But
it's still a ton. Like, you're just giving $5,000 a year away. Come on.
Yeah, I'm giving $5,000.
That's cool. That's so awesome.
When we hit that goal, that's what that's for. So I do 10% up to $5,000, and then when I get to that, I cap it there. But that's what I've been doing, and all I can say is, ask around on Twitter if you want to find out, or a message board. I'm sure you'll have folks who don't like it for one reason or another, because I missed on a player here and there for whatever it is. But I think by and large, you'll hear that it's the most comprehensive look at those positions in the class. At least 150 players. The book oftentimes in the pre-draft is more valuable than the post-draft, if you ask me. But the post-draft everyone loves, but the pre-draft is usually a 250, 300 page guide that you'll read that's bookmarked in PDF form. And I show all my work, and the work that I've often shown means the book is oftentimes 1,100 to 1,400 pages in length, though you won't look at that remaining amount unless you're just crazy like some of my readers, who I love you for your nuts, your craziness there, your nuttiness, but I'm not but most of you will look at it for what that is. But I track my own, I do my own tracking for throws, for accuracy, things like that. I've added tracking for tackles broken, types of tackles broken that you're going to see this year.
Really?
So you're actually going to, So for running backs, I'm going to show you things like by defensive line, linebacker, and defensive back, how many times they broke a reach, how many times they broke a wrap, how many times they bounced off a hit, according to those, based on those types of players that they faced. I'm literally going to be able to show you that for every player for the games that I tracked. And I track at least 3 to 4 games for every player. Sometimes I track as many as 7 to 10. So you're going to see that for that. And then with 5 receivers, you're going to see some stuff too. So I'm literally giving you data and film together that's meaningful from that perspective, to give you just an idea of, what I look at and take you through my process.
That's awesome. That's badass. I love that. Absolutely love that. So please make sure you guys go check out, everything that he's doing over there. Matt Waldman is probably one of the best guests I've ever had on the show. Absolute genius. We've had some amazing people on the show, but this guy is just crushing this episode. He stayed on an extra 30 minutes longer than we expected. He's putting his heart and soul on the line. Please go check out Matt Waldman. And next week, we actually have another Matt. We have Matt Harmon on the show with us. So very excited for him. His reception perception.
My buddy. I'm his uncle. He'll call me his uncle. I'm
I thought you meant his literal uncle.
No, just his fantasy.
What?
I'm his industry uncle, according to him.
Oh,
his two industry uncles are Sigmund Bloom and Matt Waldman. So
I should have just had you guys on together, and
I'm just
you guys could have just blown minds. But I don't think the episode would have ever ended.
We just spend time making fun of each other, probably more often than not. But I'm his fun. I'm like his Uncle Buck, whereas like I think Bloom's his like proper uncle. which if Bloom's his proper uncle, then we're in a whole mess of trouble. But there we go.
I need to reach out to Sigmund to get him on the show next.
There you go. He would do it. Absolutely would.
Yeah, he actually interviewed Troy and gave us a huge shout out over there on his last show about join our circle, because Troy King just joined the team over there. So it's been fun. It's been an interesting month, to say the least. But we appreciate you guys for coming out and joining our circle, of course. Make sure you guys go check us out at _join_our_circle. You guys can go find me at ff_intervention. We have some incredible guests coming up, and I am so ready to get this season started. This is a great start to the draft concepts, and I appreciate you for coming on, Matt. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you guys for listening, by the way, and thank you guys for letting me intervene with your fantasy football life. We're out.